Good afternoon, children. Yesterday, we have started a new chapter, chapter number 7 in It So Happened, The Open Window, which is written by H. H. Munro, and his pen name is Shaki. Very successfully, we have completed the first chapter, first part of this chapter, and in which we came to know that the title of the chapter is quite suitable, The Open Window, and it also shows the mentally fitness of the it also shows the mentally fitness of the teenage girl named Vera. As the summary of the first part, I have explained you that Mr. Frampton Nuttall was a patient of nervous system, a weak nervous system. So his doctor advised him that for its treatment he has to go to the countryside. But it was a problem with Mr. Nuttall that he was not introduced with any person in the countryside. So he told his problem to his sister. 4 years ago, his sister was living in this country, in this village, rural area, and 4 years ago, she has left this village. But she has given the introduction letter to Mr. Nuttall, and she sent Mr. Nuttall to the Sapelton house. It was the village in which the Sapelton family was living. When Mr. Nuttall reached there, Mrs. Sapelton at that time was on the first floor, and in the ground floor, her niece Bera was attending to the guest, and during the conversation, she came to know that Mr. Nuttall was a man of weak nervous system, and for this he had come here, and with the introductory letter he had come here for the treatment of his nerve system. Now, as Bera was a very intelligent girl, she decided to make fool such a person like Mr. Frampton Nuttall. Now, Mr. Nuttall was told that he has to wait until the mistress of this family, Mrs. Sapelton, was coming downstairs. So, in this way, he was he has to wait for her. So, Mr. Nuttall has to pass his time with Bera. Now, in this way, Bera was waiting for the arrival of her aunt. Now, Mr. Nuttall was feeling lonesome, and it was the duty of Bera that she has to attend him. Now, she started to take the introduction of Mr. Frampton Nuttall, and he told Vera that he has come to that place for the treatment of his disease. And Vera told him that this house belonged to her aunt, Mrs. Sapelton, but he was not directly introduced with any person in this village. So he has to come here with the introduction letter of his sister. And now Bera decided that she will make fool to such a person like Mr. Nuttall. Now she decided to tell him a story, and she explained him the story that this was the open window, and in the quiet summer season, winter season, this window was opened because 3 years ago there was a tragedy with Mrs. Sappleton. Now, Mr. Nuttall was curious about the open window, and then Vera told him that 3 years ago, in the evening, Mr. Sappleton and the two young brothers of Mrs. Sappleton had gone for the world hunting with their spaniel dog, and 3 years have been passed and they have not reached there yet. But Mrs. Sappleton has believed that one day they will return, surely they will return. That was the reason this window was always quite opened. That she always believed that one day her husband will surely return with her two younger brothers. This is the story, and tomorrow I have completed the study. I have completed the story. It was the first part of the story. Now I am ready to explain you the left part. It is the second part. Mrs. Sappleton comes down at the last and in apparently comforts her nice story. Now her nice have very completely believed about this story to Mr. Nuttall. Frampton tries to acquaint his host with the nature of his alliant. Now Mr. Nuttall was trying to tell Mrs. Sappleton about his arrival to that family. Through the open window, he can see things that versus his nerves. Now, as Vera told him about the story and what he had seen from the open window, it disturbed the peace of mind of Mr. Sappleton. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late for making her appearance. Now it was the time that Mrs. Sappleton has returned downstairs, and she says sorry to Mr. Nuttall that she came late to attend him. I hope Bera has been amusing you. करीब मैं आशा करती हूँ कि बेरा ने आपका अच्छा मनोरंजन किया होगा. She said, she has been very interesting. Then Mr. Nuttall said that Vera is a very interesting girl. I hope you don't mind the open window. At once she said, I hope you don't mind the open window, said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. When she asked about the open window, at once Mr. Nuttall was disturbed and he had completely believed the story of Bera. My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting. मेरे हस्बैंड और मेरे दोनों भाई इसी विंडो से आएंगे, वो शूटिंग के लिए गए हैं. एंड दे ऑलवेज कम इन दिस वे, वो हमेशा इसी विंडो से बाहर आते हैं, अंदर आते हैं. दे हैव बीन आउट फॉर स्नाइप ऑफ द मार्सेस टुडे, वो मार्सेस की हंटिंग के लिए गए हुए हैं. सो दे विल मेक ए फाइन मैस over my poor carpets, so like the main fog, isn't it? She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and scarcity of words. Now she was telling about the word shooting that her husband has been gone there with her two young brothers and the prospects of duck इन द विंटर और कह रहे हैं इसमें जो डक हंटिंग है उसके लिए सबसे ज़्यादा डक इस समय मिलती हैं विंटर सीजन में टू फ्रैम्पटन इट वर ऑल बट फ्रैम्पटन वॉज डिस्टर्ब विद दिस स्टोरी इट वॉज इनफ फॉर हिम दैट बेरा हैज़ ऑलरेडी टोल्ड हिम अबाउट दिस स्टोरी दैट वाई द disappearance of her husband and her younger brothers was disturbed the peace of mind of Mrs. Stapleton, and she was always asking about the arrival of her husband. Purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn to talk on to a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only the fragment of attention. Now he was fed up with this story and he wanted to change the subject, but he was fed up that his hostess, Mrs. Stapleton, was only asking him about this, only telling him about this story, and her eyes were constantly staying past to the open window. And the eyes of Mr. Stapleton, the eyes of Mr. Nuttall was always fixed at the open window and the lawn beyond. He was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on his tragic anniversary. Now, he said that it was a coincidence why he had come here for the relief and according to the treatment of his nerve disease. But here, 3 years have been passed and he was ready for a new tragedy here. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest. Now, Mr. Nuttall was trying to telling Mrs. Stapleton about his disease. Now he has started his chapter because completely he want to change the topic of their discussion because he was not interested about the story of the open window. So he want to change the chapter and then again he started his story. The doctors agree to ordering me complete rest और absence of mental excitement. डॉक्टर्स ने मुझे कहा है कि बिल्कुल मुझे मेंटल एक्साइटमेंट नहीं रहना है और मुझे कंप्लीट रेस्ट करना है एंड अवॉइडेंस ऑफ एनीथिंग इन द नेचर ऑफ वायोलेंट फिजिकल एक्सरसाइज किसी तरह की फिजिकल एक्सरसाइज से किसी तरह की वायलेंट एक्सरसाइज से मुझे बचना है अनाउंस्ड फ्रैम्पटन who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion. The total strangers and chance acquaintance are hungry for the least detail of one's alliance and intrigues, their cause and cure. So he has come here for the cure of this disease. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement. And the matter of diet, he was ready to take anything, he continued. No, said Mrs. Stapleton. Now, Mrs. Stapleton have interrupted Mr. Nuttall and said, no, said Mrs. Stapleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. She was not interested that to what was Frampton saying. Here are the last, at last. शायद वो आ रहे हैं, she said, just in the time for tea. लग रहा है चाय के समय तक वो आ जाएंगे. And don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes. कह रहा अगर उनके कपड़े गंदे हों मडी हों तो यू हैव टू डोंट माइंड. नो दिस इज द कंप्लीट अपोजिट नेचर of the hostess and the guest. Mr. Frampton Nuttall was trying to change the subject, and he was telling the story to Mrs. Sapleton about his nervous system disease, and he was trying to tell him what the doctors had been advised him, and which type of diet he wanted, and for this treatment, for the relief of this treatment, he has to come in this village. But at once Mr. Nuttall thought that he felt that although Mrs. Sapleton was not interested in his story, and she at once changed the subject and told that his that her husband and her brothers will return before the tea time, and she believed Mr. Nuttall that he had not to mind if they come with the muddy clothes and the muddy face. Now, this is the story. Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece. At once he turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. Now, Mr. Nuttall was trying to tell Bera that completely he was agree with him, with her. The child was staring out through the open window. Now she was also staring about the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. Now, in this chill cold, Mr. Frampton Nuttall was also lost his peace of mind, and started he has also started to see outside of the window. In the deepening twilight, three figures were walking across the lawn. When Mr. Nuttall was watching outside of the window, at once in the twilight, it was the time of night, evening, he saw the three figures were walking across the lawn. उस लॉन में से उसने तीन लोगों को आते हुए देखा विंडो. दे ऑल कैरीड गन्स अंडर देयर आर्म्स. उनके तीनों के हाथ में गन्स थीं. एंड वन ऑफ देम वाज एडिशनली बर्डनड विद ए वाइट कोट हंग ओवर हिज शोल्डर्स. उनके पास एक वाइट कोट ओवरकोट था जो अपने उसने कंधों पर डाल रखा था. ए टायर्ड ब्राउन स्पैनियल kept close at their heels. उनके साथ में एक स्पेनियल डॉग जो है ब्राउन कलर का वो भी चल रहा था. noiselessly they neared the house. जैसे ही वो घर के पास पहुंचे, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk. At once a sound was heard out of the dusk. I say, Verti, why do you want? Verti, why do you want? It was enough to Mr. Nuttall. Mr. Nuttall के लिए यह पर्याप्त था. Because he had believed, he forgot all about his disease, and he was completely believed that these persons who had gone 3 years ago through this window, now they are returning here. Surely they were the ghosts. Frampton gravelled wildly at his stick and hat. At once Mr. Nuttall took his stick and hat. The hall door. At once he came to the hall door, the gravel drive, and then front gate were dimly noted stages to his healing retreat. At once he had left the house and healing retreat. He started his journey to his home, towards his home. A cyclist coming along the road. He met a cyclist who was coming along the road, had to run into the haze to avoid imminent collision. इतना एक साइकिल वाला इतनी तेज नहीं चलेगा. मिस्टर नटल डर के मारे इतनी तेज गेट से बाहर. चले गए। हियर वी आर, हम आ गए माई डियर, सेड द वियरर ऑफ द वाइट मैकिस्टॉस। वो हस्बैंड कहते हैं हियर डियर वी हैव कम, कमिंग इन थ्रू द विंडो, हम उस खिड़की से ही बाहर आए हैं। हु वाज दैट हु बोल्टेड आउट एज वी कम इन, लेकिन वो कौन बंदा था, वो कौन था जो जैसे ही हम लोग यहाँ आए वो यहाँ से निकल के भाग गया। हु वाज दैट पर्सन? अ मोस्ट एक्स्ट्रा ऑर्डिनरी मैन to Mr. Nuttall. At once Mrs. Stapleton said, he was very extraordinary man and his name was Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Stapleton. He could only talk about his illness. वो जब से आया केवल अपनी बीमारी के बारे में ही बातें कर रहा था। And dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. और जिसने मुझसे कुछ नहीं कहा, ना उसने मुझसे पार्टिंग वर्ड्स कहे, ना कोई माफ़ी मांगी, ना गुड बाय कहा, जैसे उसने आपको आते हुए देखा, एट वंस ही लेफ्ट द हाउस एंड रैन अवे फ्रॉम हियर, वो यहां से तुरंत भाग गया। वन वुड थिंक ही हैड सीन अ गोस्ट, ऐसा लग रहा था जैसे उसने यहां कोई भूत देख लिया हो। आई एक्सपेक्टेड इट वॉज द स्पेनियल। एट वंस बेरा चेंज द सब्जेक्ट। बेरा कहती है नहीं, मुझे ये लग रहा था जैसे वो स्पेनियल डॉग को देख के भागा हो। आई एक्सपेक्टेड एज इट वॉज द स्पेनियल, शायद उस कुत्ते को देख के भागा हो। सेड द नाइस कामली, ही टोल्ड मी ही हैड ए हॉरर ऑफ डॉग्स। यहाँ बैठे जब आप नहीं थी अपनी आंट से कहती है, उसने मुझे बताया था कि वो कुत्तों से बहुत डरता है। ही वॉज वंस हॉन्टेड इन टू ए सीमेंट्री समवेयर ऑन द बैंक्स ऑफ द गैंग्स बाय द पैक ऑफ डॉग्स। तो कहती है उसने मुझे बताया था कि एक बार जो है वह फंस गई थी, एक बार जो है कुत्तों के गैंग ने उसे घेर लिया था एक गली में, तब से वह कुत्तों से बहुत डरता है। समवेयर ऑफ द बैंक्स ऑफ द गैंग्स बाय ए पैक ऑफ डॉग्स एंड हैड टू स्पेंड द नाइट इन ए न्यूली डग ग्रेव विद द क्रिएचर्स स्नेयरिंग एंड ग्रिमिंग and foaming just above him. I think that was the reason when he saw the spaniel dog, at once he ran away and left the home. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve. That was the reason. It was enough, such like a person who has lost their nerves. He was not fully confident about himself, and that was the reason he has left the home when he saw the spaniel dog. Romance is short notice was her specialty, and he was always romance at the short notice was her specialty. It was the specialty of his character that he has left a small romance here, and thus with this words your chapter is completed, and a complete PDF of the question answers I will send you, and very successfully student, now I want to tell you what is the summary of this story. Mr. Nuttall has come here as a guest, and he was the patient of the nervous system. So doctor had advised him that he had to go in the countryside, कि वो गांव में जाके रहे वहाँ, इसलिए वह वहाँ अपनी बहन का इंट्रोडक्शन लेटर लेके यहाँ मिस्टर सैपल्टन और मिसेस सैपल्टन के यहाँ रहने आया था। और मिसेस सैपल्टन उस समय बिजी थी तो उसको वेट करना पड़ा। तो यहाँ पर जो बेरा जो थी, जो उसकी नीस थी, उसकी भतीजी थी मिसेस सैपल्टन की, उसने उसे विश्वास दिला दिया कि ये खिड़की खुली रहती है। इट वॉज द क्रिएशन ऑफ द माइंड ऑफ द गर्ल, कि अब हालांकि ये जो मिसेस सैपल्टन, मिस्टर सैपल्टन और मिसेस सैपल्टन के जो भाई थे दोनों, वो सुबह ही गए थे शिकार को, लेकिन उसने ऐसी स्टोरी क्रिएट की और मिस्टर नटल को ये विश्वास दिला दिया कि वो लोग 3 साल पहले गए थे, वो आज तक लौट कर नहीं आए हैं। और मिसेस सैपल्टन जो है वो मेंटली अपसेट हैं, उन्हें ये विश्वास है कि वो जो जब भी लौटेंगे वो इसी खिड़की से लौटेंगे। यही रीज़न है कि ये खिड़की हमेशा खुली रहती है। अब because it was a story and it was a general event that a person who had went for bird hunting in the morning, surely he will return in the evening. और जैसे ही बट मिस्टर नटल को ये विश्वास था कि वो जो है 3 साल पहले गए थे, 3 years बिफोर दे हैड गॉन फॉर द वर्ल्ड हंटिंग। लेकिन जब वो लौट कर आए शाम को, तो मिस्टर नटल को ये लगा जैसे वो नहीं भूत आ गया हो कोई, और वो डर के मारे वो वहाँ से तुरंत भाग गए। दिस इज द स्टोरी दैट हाउ अ टीनेजर girl, 15 years girl, old girl, Vera had made the fool to a person, to a young man, such like Mr. Nuttall. So this is the whole story, and I will send you the complete PDF of this chapter after